Along with the family, many in the city of Hazleton received the answers they so longed for today.
Residents who lived through it still remember the uncertainty in the days following Chiverella's murder. Newswatch 16's Marshall Keeley was back in the community where Marise Chiverella once lived.
8:10 a.m. March 18, 1964, Hazleton, Pennsylvania. 9-year-old Marise Ann Chiverella left her home and started walking to school. In her hands, she carried a few cans of food, a small gift for her teachers, the kind of thoughtful gesture only a kind-hearted child would make. Her home was less than half a mile from St. Joseph's School. That morning, she never made it there. At 1 p.m. on March 18th, a man teaching his 16-year-old nephew how to drive stopped near an abandoned mine shaft on the outskirts of Hazel Township. He looked down. At first, he thought he was looking at a large doll. Pennsylvania State Police arrived at 1:30 p.m. Marisa's body was lying several meters down inside the shaft. Beside her were the same cans of food she had been carrying to her teachers that morning. The medical examiner determined the cause of death: rape and strangulation. She was murdered sometime between 8:10 a.m. and 1 p.m., in broad daylight, on an ordinary city street. When investigators recovered her body, they found unidentified biological evidence on both her body and her clothing. The detectives leading the investigation preserved those biological samples in 1964. For the next 58 years, that evidence waited for a technology that did not yet exist. Marise Chiverella was a third-grade student at St. Joseph's School, a Catholic parochial school serving Hazleton's Slovak-American community. Years later, her younger sister, Carmen, would describe her as a quiet and kind little girl who dreamed of becoming a nun and loved playing the organ. That street has never been the same. Not because it disappeared, but because for the people who lived in that neighborhood and knew the Chiverella family, it never could be. In 1964, Hazleton was a coal mining town built on hard-working families where nearly everyone knew everyone else. The murder of a 9-year-old girl in broad daylight tore through the community and left a wound that never truly healed. That same evening, March 18, 1964, the Pennsylvania State Police officially launched the investigation. Detectives interviewed everyone who lived or worked along Marisa's route to school. They questioned drivers who had passed through the area between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock that morning. They investigated men with suspicious backgrounds throughout the region. They compared blood types with the biological evidence collected from the crime scene. Suspect after suspect was investigated. One had a confirmed alibi. Another's blood type did not match. A third could not have physically been there. One by one, every lead was eliminated. Not a single name survived every test. And James Paul Forte, a 22-year-old bartender who lived just 6 blocks from where Marise disappeared, whose blood type matched, and who could have been on that street between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock that morning, never appeared in the original investigation as a suspect. He was never questioned. No one ever knocked on his door with the right questions, 6 blocks away, and not a single interview. For the next years, then decades, the case of Marise Chiverella remained open in the archives of the Pennsylvania State Police. Never closed, never forgotten, still open. Over the course of 58 years, more than 230 investigators worked on the case. Some began the investigation in 1964 and stayed with it until retirement. Others came later and inherited the work of those before them. More than 4,000 pages of documents were compiled. Interview transcripts, investigative notes, suspect files, and laboratory reports. Decades of accumulated information, yet not a single piece led investigators to a name. The Pennsylvania State Police has existed since 1905, 117 years as of 2022. More than half of that history, 58 years, was devoted to the case of a 9-year-old girl from Hazleton. When improved blood group analysis became available in the 1970s, investigators reviewed the case. When protein electrophoresis emerged in the 1980s, they reviewed it again. When DNA technology arrived in the 1990s and 2000s, they reviewed it once more. In 2007, 43 years after the murder, The Pennsylvania State Police DNA Laboratory applied new forensic methods to biological evidence preserved since 1964 and, for the first time in the history of the case, obtained the killer's complete individual DNA profile. What had been impossible in 1964 became possible after 43 years of preserving the evidence. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, the National DNA Database of Convicted Offenders. The search produced no match. Marise's killer had never had his DNA entered into the system. He had never been convicted of a crime that required DNA collection. He lived and died without ever appearing in any forensic database. For the next 15 years, from 2007 to 2022, the DNA profile was checked every month against every new entry added to CODIS. Not a single match. In 2019, Parabon Nanolabs used DNA phenotyping technology to create 3 facial reconstructions of the suspect, showing how he may have looked at the ages of 25, 40, and 60, based solely on the genetic evidence preserved since 1964. The Pennsylvania State Police released the images. News outlets across Pennsylvania covered the story. Cold case websites shared them. Forte had died in 1980, nearly 40 years before the images were published. Perhaps that was why no one who had known him recognized the face, or perhaps too much time had passed. But the release of those images accomplished one important thing. It brought the Marise Chiverella case back into the public eye, to a larger audience than ever before, including students at a college in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Eric Schubert was 18 years old, a first-year history student at Elizabethtown College. He spent his time at home reading about unsolved crimes. One case caught his attention: Marise Chiverella.
I read about how horrific and disturbing the crime was. It really struck me, and I knew that if there was any way I could help, I wanted to, he said later.
He wrote a letter to the Pennsylvania State Police.
I'm a college student with experience in genetic genealogy. I've been reading about the Marise Chiverella case. If I wouldn't interfere with the investigation, I'd be happy to help.
Trooper Petrosky, who received the letter, later said,
For the Pennsylvania State Police, it was a little unconventional, but it turned out to be the right decision.
He had been researching genealogy since he was 10 years old. He started by building family trees for relatives, then went on to help people identify their biological parents. By the age of 18, he had experience that many professional investigators did not. The idea behind genetic genealogy is simple, but revolutionary. Instead of searching for a suspect's DNA directly in criminal databases, investigators upload the DNA profile to public genealogy databases, where millions of people have voluntarily shared their DNA in search of relatives. The method doesn't search for the killer directly. It searches for his family. Once distant DNA matches are found, investigators build family trees from those relatives, narrowing one branch after another until they reach a single name. Parabon Nanolabs uploaded the DNA profile to GEDmatch in 2018 and found a distant relative of the suspect, possibly a sixth cousin, someone who shared enough DNA to appear as a distant match in the database, but not enough to identify the killer directly. From that point, Schubert began building the family tree. Archived records, census records, birth, marriage, and death certificates, obituaries in local newspapers, thousands of scattered pieces of public information that, when assembled correctly, formed a family tree, branch by branch, leading closer and closer to a single name.
It was probably the most difficult genealogy project I've ever worked on, probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life,
he said later. Schubert worked on the case for 2 years, from an 18-year-old college student who sent a letter offering his help, to a 20-year-old standing beside Pennsylvania State Police investigators at a press conference.
At a certain point, I knew we were going to find the answer,
he said. The family tree Schubert built led to one final name: James Paul Forte, 22 years old in 1964, a bartender from Hazleton, born and raised in the same town where the Chiverella family lived. Not a stranger, not a passerby from another town. Someone who belonged to that community, the kind of person who had lived there his entire life. He lived just 6 blocks from the place where Marise was last seen. Forte had a prior conviction for the sexual assault of a woman who survived, an offense committed before Marise's murder. That crime showed that what happened on March 18, 1964, was not an isolated act. It was part of a pattern. After Marise's murder, he continued living in HAZLETON, the same town where the Chiverella family remained, the same town where Marise's parents and sisters went to the grocery store, attended church, and lived with their grief. He could have walked past them on the street. Forte lived for another 16 years after Marise's murder. 16 years during which not a single detective knocked on his door with the right questions. He died of natural causes, possibly a heart attack, in May 1980 at the age of 38. 42 years passed before his name finally became part of the investigation. When Forte's name emerged from Schubert's family tree, investigators faced the final challenge of the entire 58-year investigation. But Forte had been dead for more than 40 years. They couldn't ask him to provide a DNA sample. They couldn't question him. They couldn't obtain a voluntary reference sample. There was only one option left. On January 6, 2022, the Pennsylvania State Police exhumed the body of James Paul Forte. Tissue samples were collected from his remains and sent to the laboratory. On February 3, 2022, the results came back. The DNA recovered from Forte's exhumed remains was an exact match to the DNA recovered from the clothing of Marise Ann Chiverella on March 18, 1964. The Pennsylvania State Police described the certainty of the result with one statement.
By our calculations, approximately 117 billion people have lived on Earth throughout its history. To find another person with the same DNA profile as James Paul Forte, you would have to search more than 4 million planets the size of Earth.
This was no longer a matter of probability or reasonable doubt. It was definitive scientific confirmation. February 10, 2022. A press conference in HAZLETON. The room was filled with current and former Pennsylvania State Police investigators. Among them stood the first officer assigned to the case in 1964, a man who lived long enough to see it solved. Nearby stood Marise's 4 siblings. Lead investigator Corporal Mark Barron said,
"This is a very important day for our agency. Even though it took nearly 58 years to solve this case, we hope it gives families of victims across the country hope. No matter what happens, we never give up. In life or in death, we will find you."
Marise's younger sister, Carmen Marie Ratka, told reporters,
"We have so many precious memories of Marise. At the same time, our family will always carry the emptiness and sadness of her absence. We now know who killed her. Today, justice has been served."
3 things remain from this case. The first is the lunchboxes. A 9-year-old girl left home carrying canned food for her teachers. When investigators found her body, the lunchboxes were still lying beside her. The killer left them behind. That small act of kindness became one of the most heartbreaking images of the entire case. The second is persistence. For 58 years, investigators refused to close the case. Generation after generation carried the investigation forward until someone finally found the answer. The third is a reminder that technology changes what justice is capable of. Cody's could not identify the killer. Genetic genealogy did. James Paul Forte died in 1980. His DNA never entered a criminal database, but it lived on in his relatives. On March 18, 1964, Marise Chiverella left for school carrying lunchboxes. She never came home. 58 years later, her family finally learned who killed her. Before you go, one question: what stayed with you the most? If stories like this matter to you, there are many more still waiting to be told.